Wolves fans, we've got two stories to talk about today, and they're hitting two completely different parts of this franchise. One is about what Minnesota can still do to strengthen this roster before the season really gets going. I'm not gonna lie, the options are starting to disappear fast. Something happened around the league that just made the Wolves situation a whole lot more uncomfortable, because one of the better solutions that was sitting out there is officially gone. And when you look at what Minnesota needs, what's still available, and how difficult the next move could be, there's suddenly a lot more pressure on the front office to get this right. But then, our second story goes way beyond one roster move. This one is about the people making the decisions, the direction of this franchise, and whether the man helping build Minnesota into a legitimate contender is actually going to be here for the long haul. We just got an update that should make Wolves fans feel a lot better about where this organization is headed, especially after all the uncertainty surrounding the future behind the scenes. So yeah, we've got two important Wolves stories today, and I want to get into both because together they tell us a lot about where this team stands right now. But before we do, if you're enjoying these Wolves conversations, hit that like button and subscribe. I'm Henry, and this channel is still brand new, so our first goal is getting this community to 300 subscribers. But seriously, only subscribe if you're a real Wolves fan and you actually want to be part of this thing from the beginning. There's something pretty cool about being able to say you were here before the first 300. Alright, Wolves fans, let's get into the first story. It's late August, and the Minnesota Timberwolves are still looking for another power forward who can actually give them quality rotation minutes. And one of the most logical fallback options is officially gone. Georges Niang has agreed to a one-year $3.9 million deal with the Golden State Warriors. According to Shams Charania, Niang's agents, Mark Bartelstein and Andy Schiffman of Priority Sports, confirmed the agreement. And this matters for Minnesota because Niang made a ton of sense as a backup plan if the Wolves couldn't land Jonathan Kuminga. Niang is entering his 11th NBA season, and he's a career 40% three-point shooter. He missed the entire 2025-2026 season because of a foot injury, so obviously there was some risk involved there. But before that injury, he was still a quality contributor during the 2024-2025 season. And stylistically, I really understand why people looked at Niang and thought that guy could work in Minnesota. He can space the floor. He's an excellent spot-up shooter. He understands how to keep an offense connected without needing the basketball in his hands all the time. And Tim Connelly has talked about wanting players who can do more with less. That description fits Niang pretty well. Minnesota had also been indirectly connected to him during the offseason. Back in July, the Steinline reported that teams involved in the LeBron James market were also looking at Niang, so there was enough there to make you wonder whether Minnesota could eventually turn toward Niang. If the Jonathan Kuminga pursuit didn't work, well, that door is closed now. Niang is going to Golden State, and suddenly the Wolves' options at power forward are getting really thin. And that puts even more attention on Jonathan Kuminga. Minnesota's chances of landing Kuminga arguably improved when Peyton Watson signed with the Cleveland Cavaliers. According to the current picture, Minnesota is competing with the Los Angeles Lakers and Milwaukee Bucks for Kuminga. But here's the problem. The Wolves don't have a simple financial path to getting this done. As the roster currently stands, Minnesota can only offer Kuminga a minimum contract. And that is a massive hurdle. Kuminga would have to leave significant money on the table to choose Minnesota under those circumstances. Maybe he absolutely loves the basketball fit. Maybe he sees the opportunity to compete alongside Anthony Edwards and believes Minnesota gives him what he wants. But asking a talented player to sacrifice serious money is never something you can just assume will happen. The Wolves do have ways to create more flexibility, but none of them are clean. One possibility would be waiving and stretching Josh Green to create additional space. There's also the possibility of a sign-in trade. Neither option is impossible, but neither one is just a simple, easy transaction either. And that's where the Los Angeles Lakers become such a serious threat. Their path to signing Kuminga is smoother, and they can also sell him on being part of a team trying to win. So even if you believe Minnesota has a legitimate shot at Kuminga, you cannot treat this like a done deal. That's why losing Niang as a potential fallback hurts. If Kuminga chooses Minnesota, great. Suddenly, we probably aren't spending much time worrying about Georges Niang going to Golden State. But what happens if Kuminga chooses the Lakers? What happens if Milwaukee finds a way? What happens if Minnesota simply can't make the money work? Then you look around at the remaining free agent market and start asking who exactly is left. Veterans like Kevin Love or Jeff Green could potentially become depth options. And listen, those guys have been around forever for a reason. There's value in experience, leadership, and understanding how to play winning basketball. But if Minnesota's goal is to find a natural power forward capable of giving them reliable rotation minutes, that's not exactly the same outcome as landing Kuminga or even adding a healthy Niang. There is another route, and this is where September 10th becomes an important date. That's when Josh Green becomes eligible to be aggregated in a trade with other Timberwolves players. At that point, Minnesota could potentially look at the trade market for a mid-salaried forward. But even that gets complicated because the Wolves don't exactly have this enormous treasure chest of assets sitting around. Minnesota's lack of draft capital makes those conversations harder. And they also don't have an obvious collection of high-end trade candidates they can casually throw into deals. So Tim Connelly would have to get creative again. And if nothing happens, then Chris Finch may be looking at power forward by committee. Josh Green could spend time there. Jaden McDaniels could slide up. Terrence Shannon Jr. could be asked to play out of position. Jalen Clark could get minutes there. And yes, we could even see Anthony Edwards spending significant stretches guarding opposing fours. Now, before we act like that automatically destroys Minnesota's season, I actually think there's an important point here. The modern NBA isn't overflowing with huge, dominant, star-level power forwards on every roster. Minnesota also has a strong defensive infrastructure that can cover for some positional imperfections. We know what Jaden McDaniels can do defensively. We know what Ant can do physically when he's locked in. This team has enough size, athleticism, and defensive versatility that they could survive a committee approach. But surviving something and maximizing a championship roster are two very different things. That's what bothers me. When you're trying to compete for a championship, you don't want to enter the season saying that you can probably get away with this. You want Chris Finch to have real options. You want players in natural roles. And you especially want enough depth to survive the injuries and matchup problems that inevitably come during an NBA season. That's why the Jonathan Kuminga situation suddenly feels so much bigger. Peyton Watson is gone to Cleveland. Georges Niang is gone to Golden State. The list keeps getting shorter, and Minnesota still needs an answer. But now, let's get to our second story, because this one could have much bigger implications for the long-term future of the Timberwolves. And thankfully, this update is a lot more encouraging. Tim Connelly's future in Minnesota is beginning to look much more secure, and I think Wolves fans should be very happy about that. Connelly is entering the final year of his current contract in 2026. Normally, having your president of basketball operations entering an expiring contract might not create panic. But look at Minnesota's situation. This is the executive who has been the architect of a team that reached the Western Conference Finals twice in 3 years. Minnesota also has no tradable first-round picks right now. When you're operating with those limitations, organizational stability matters even more. You need the person making those decisions to know he's building something for the future, rather than wondering whether he'll even be around to finish the job. And the ownership situation added another layer of uncertainty. Mark Stad taking over for Mark Lore as the Timberwolves' controlling owner naturally raised questions about what that could mean for Connelly. Different owners have different philosophies. Just because one ownership group believes strongly in an executive doesn't automatically mean the next person controlling the franchise is going to feel exactly the same way. And Mark Lore was instrumental in bringing Connelly to Minnesota back in 2022. The Wolves gave Connelly $40 million over 5 years. That's a massive commitment. So when ownership control shifts and your lead basketball executive is entering the final year of his contract, of course people are going to wonder what comes next. But Mark Stein provided a really encouraging update. Stein reported that Tim Connelly has a strong relationship with Mark Stad, and that is huge. Stein specifically pointed to that relationship as something that figures to be important because Connelly needs a new contract. We already knew that Stad shares a vision with Mark Lore, but getting specific reporting about Stad's relationship with Connelly makes this feel much more concrete. And there's another part of this story that Wolves fans should remember. The Dallas Mavericks were interested in pursuing Connelly for their front office vacancy earlier this year. But Dallas ultimately accepted that it wasn't going to receive permission to pursue him. That tells you something about how Connelly is viewed around this league. Minnesota has somebody other organizations would love to get their hands on. And now, with the ownership transition moving forward, it makes sense that contract discussions could start becoming more serious. Waiting was understandable. The ownership situation had been hanging over the organization for months, and trying to finalize a major long-term agreement with the lead basketball decision-maker while control of the franchise was changing hands could have made things unnecessarily complicated for everyone. Now there should be more clarity. And maybe the most encouraging part of all of this is that Connelly himself has already made his feelings about Minnesota pretty clear. During an appearance on the John Kravchinsky show, Connelly said they were super locked in Minnesota and described this place as home. He acknowledged that there had been opportunities elsewhere, but he talked about believing this team could be special and how positive his experience with the organization has been. That's exactly what I want to hear. Because whether you agree with every single move Tim Connelly has made or not, you cannot accuse this man of being scared. Connelly has been aggressive from basically the moment he arrived. Just months into his Timberwolves tenure, he made the enormous trade for Rudy Gobert, sending out a massive package of draft capital. Remember how much criticism Minnesota took for that trade? People laughed at the Wolves. And yet Minnesota does not make those deep playoff runs without Rudy Gobert. That trade has become a major success for this franchise. Then Connelly traded up to get Rob Dillingham. That one did not work out the way Minnesota hoped. And that's important to acknowledge because we don't need to pretend Connelly has been perfect. He hasn't. The Karl-Anthony Towns trade after Minnesota reached the conference finals also backfired. Those are real misses. But then look at the other side of it. This summer, Connelly traded for LaMelo Ball. The final verdict on that move obviously hasn't been written yet, but the basketball idea is fascinating because Ball projects as the kind of co-star who can complement Anthony Edwards while directly attacking one of Minnesota's biggest weaknesses, which is playmaking. If LaMelo can unlock another level of this offense next to Ant, that could change the ceiling of this team. And some of Connelly's best work hasn't necessarily been the blockbuster stuff. Think about the 2023 trade that brought Mike Conley and Nickel Alexander-Walker to Minnesota. That was an excellent move. Those are the transactions that can completely change a team without dominating every headline. And after the mistakes involving Dillingham and allowing Nickel Alexander-Walker to leave, Connelly went out and acquired Ayo Dosunmu. That helped correct those mistakes and gave Minnesota another valuable role player. Championship teams need stars, obviously. But they also need executives who can find those players around the margins. Guys who defend, guys who fit. Guys who don't need 20 shots every night to impact winning. And that brings us back to the bigger picture with Tim Connelly. Look at what Minnesota has accomplished under his leadership. 2 Western Conference Finals appearances in 3 years. And outside of Rudy Gobert, everybody on this roster is 26 years old or younger. Think about that. This isn't supposed to be some last-gasp veteran team trying to squeeze one final playoff run out of an aging core. Anthony Edwards is still young. LaMelo Ball is still young. Jaden McDaniels is still young. There's a legitimate opportunity here to build something that can compete for years. And when Anthony Edwards is your franchise player, being conservative cannot become the organizational philosophy. You have to maximize these years. You have to take calculated risks. You have to be willing to make uncomfortable decisions if you believe they can move you closer to a championship. Tim Connelly has shown that willingness over and over again. Sometimes it works, sometimes it blows up in your face. That's professional sports. But I would rather have a front office that aggressively tries to maximize Ant's championship window than one that becomes terrified of making the next mistake. And that's why this report about Connelly and Mark Stad matters so much. A strong relationship between the new controlling owner and the president of basketball operations creates stability. Connelly has already said Minnesota feels like home. Mark Stein's reporting suggests the relationship is strong. So right now, everything appears to be pointing toward a new deal eventually getting done. And if that happens, I think it's absolutely a positive for Minnesota. Because when you put these two stories together, you can see exactly where the Timberwolves are as a franchise. They're really good, they're ambitious. They have one of the league's premier young stars in Anthony Edwards. They've reached the conference finals twice in 3 seasons, but the work is not finished. Right now, there's still a hole at power forward. Georges Niang is no longer available after signing with the Warriors. Jonathan Kuminga is now even more important. But Minnesota has financial obstacles to overcome, with the Lakers and Bucks still in the picture. If Kuminga doesn't come, the Wolves may have to consider Kevin Love, Jeff Green, a trade after September 10th. Or simply ask Chris Finch to make a power forward by committee approach, work with Josh Green, Jaden McDaniels, Terrence Shannon Jr., Jalen Clark, and even Anthony Edwards absorbing some of those minutes. That's not necessarily catastrophic. But for a team thinking about a championship, you always want to improve the margins. And the person responsible for figuring out those margins is Tim Connelly. That's why keeping him matters. He helped build this version of the Timberwolves, and now the challenge is finishing the job. We've watched this franchise get close. We've felt what those deep playoff runs are like. And once you get that close, expectations change. Conference finals appearances are something to be proud of, but eventually you want more. You want the finals. You want a championship. And with Ant entering the heart of his career, Minnesota cannot waste opportunities. So now we watch what Connelly does with this final roster spot and this power forward problem. And we watch what Mark Stad and the ownership group do with Connelly himself. Because both decisions could matter a whole lot when we look back at this era of Timberwolves basketball. Now, I want to hear from you, Wolves fans. How badly do you want Jonathan Kuminga in Minnesota? And if the Wolves can't get him, would you rather see them pursue another veteran like Kevin Love or Jeff Green? Wait for the trade market to open up, or trust Chris Finch to make the power forward by committee approach work? And on Tim Connelly, I really want your opinion. After everything he's done with Rudy Gobert, Rob Dillingham, Karl Anthony Towns, LaMelo Ball, Mike Conley, Nickel Alexander-Walker, and Ayo Dosunmu, do you want Connelly running this franchise for the next several years? Drop your take in the comments, because I know Wolves fans are going to have some very different opinions on this one. And if you enjoyed talking Wolves basketball with me today, hit the like button. It really helps us build this community. The channel is still new, and we're chasing our first 300 subscribers. But like I said earlier, subscribe only if you genuinely believe in the future of these Timberwolves and want to be here talking about every move, every rumor, every win, every frustrating loss, and hopefully one day, that championship run. If you're one of the people who gets us to that first 300, you'll always be able to say you were here at the beginning. I'm Henry, this is our Wolves community, and I'll see you in the next one.